Biafra, superstars, media.
Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to sit back and relax and listen to a very good analysis of a journalist from the Western world on how they explain the situations in that zoo called Nigeria. I hope going forward, our so-called journalists in that zoo called Nigeria will take a cue and learn from this. Thank you.
Nigeria is an economic freefall, and this story is wild. At the beginning of August of 2024, thousands of Nigerians began to protest across the country, largely taking inspiration from weeks-long protests that have been seen in Kenya, which is probably another story that we could do here on this channel. Organizers at the time of the launch of these protests called for 10 days of demonstrations that were aimed at forcing the government to address the problems that the nation is facing: high cost of living, state neglect, and also worsening security within the country itself. My friends, when I talk about this, what is absolutely insane about the story is that we are talking about Nigeria, a state that 2 years ago was the biggest economy in Africa. But in just those 2 years, only those 2 years, it has managed to slip from that crown position and is now projected to be the only fourth biggest economy in Africa by the end of this year. For all we know, at the time that I'm making this video, it may have already dropped to fourth place. We don't know that yet. All of this is happening because Nigeria is facing its worst economic crisis in decades. We're talking about something with skyrocketing inflation, a national currency in freefall, and millions of people who are struggling to buy food. The pain of all of this is incredibly widespread, and it affects just about every single aspect of society. Unions are striking in order to protest salaries of around $20 a month. People end up dying in stampedes, all desperate to try to get free sacks of rice. Hospitals are overrun with pregnant women who are racked by spasms from nutrition deficiencies. And these are relatively new developments. Because of how bad things have gotten and how quickly they have gotten that bad, demonstrators argue that there really is just no indication from Nigeria's political elite that they even understand what is going on in the country, the issues of the everyday ordinary Nigerians. They demand as well a reversal of a set of economic reforms that the current president of Nigeria, Bola Tinubu, had only implemented just this past year, which we will then be explaining, because all of this, everything that I've talked about here so far, this would all culminate in protests, which would be called the very fitting name, the End Bad Governance protests. Which, no, I'm not exaggerating that name. That is actually the name of the protest and what it is that they are called. They are very on the nose about this. But, all that being said, as always, before it is that we explain the protests themselves, we're going to, of course, have to explain how it is that we got here in the first place, what exactly is happening now, and what will potentially then happen in the future. To begin, my friends, we are talking, of course, about the country Nigeria. Now, Nigeria, as I said previously until this year, was Africa's biggest economy. It is the largest democracy on the entire continent, and it is home to the sixth largest population in the entire world, with over 220 million people. Not only is that a big number, but what is insane in comparison to other large countries is that half of the population, we're talking around 110 million people, are 17 years old or under. Yes, my friends, in comparison to many places that have a birth crisis in the sense that they are not having enough children, like we have covered with Asia and other places, that is not a problem for Nigeria. In fact, the bigger problem is that the economy seems to have not grown fast enough or well enough in order to be able to accommodate all the young people who are trying to grow up and get jobs. The population is expected to more than double in the next 50 years to 485 million, which would add even more people than any other country in the world over that time period. Again, we are going to talk about that here later, but the short of it is that that puts a huge demand upon the country for growth in order to actually employ those people, which is a very difficult problem to face because the country, like its population, is quite young and inexperienced. Now, I'm not going to be going into the full history of Nigeria, as that would simply take far too long, but to sum it up and also explain the absolute chaos of this state, let's dive into this here. But my friends, before we continue on with today's history lesson, I would just like to share with you all a little bit of my own history with today's sponsor, MyHeritage. For those of you that are out there in Europe now that potentially can find me, give it a shot yourself. I'm genuinely curious to see if any of you are related to me. Moving through quite literally thousands of years of history at a rapid pace, Nigeria has had indigenous states and kingdoms since at least the 2nd millennium BC, including a variety of names such as the Nok civilization in 15th century BC. The region was also influenced by powerful West African kingdoms such as the Oyo Empire, the Igbo, and also the Kanem-Bornu trading empire. As time went on, the advent of Islam would also play a large role role in the growth of centralized states in the region, as these varying different states would raid each other for slaves for their own devices, or just try and sell them into the Islamic slave trade routes in order to be able to make money and get access to outside manufactured goods. This is how things would largely persist for many years under varying different kingdoms, even after the arrival of Europeans in the 15th century. That is, until around the 19th century, which, considering African colonial history, you can probably guess what happened. In the 19th century, the British would come in and colonize Nigeria, and would establish administrative and legal structures that would unify the region into one. Eventually. At first, it wasn't quite like that. In many cases, the British would practice indirect rule through traditional chiefdoms, in which these varying different minor states were protectorates as part of the overall larger colony. But then, in 1901, Nigeria itself would become a British protectorate. So it was then, only 13 years later, that the modern state of Nigeria would take shape in 1914, when the southern and northern Nigeria protectorates were merged into one, thus giving us the united colony that would be under the control of the British. You may wonder why it is that we're even talking about in the first place. It is very important to specify, like many African
350
countries, that this is a country, a united colony, that was created out of a combination of many different peoples under one flag, so to speak. Varying different tribes, kingdoms, languages, different customs, cultures, all of these were placed together under British rule. This same setup would exist long after the British had left. But either way, under the British colonial administration, purchasing cartels, and in that case we're talking about companies such as Nestle and Cadbury and other things. Yes, I'm sure you all recognize the names here right now. Those are actually quite important major companies. They were quite involved in the colonial trades in varying degrees. These companies had so much power in the varying regions that what they would try and do is that they would keep the prices of cocoa, palm oil, peanuts, things that the region would be exporting artificially low. And thus by keeping the prices low, this would damage Nigerian agriculture and keep things as a simple extraction-based colonial economy, which could be pretty bad for local Nigerians. But on the other hand, one of the things that also happened in order to get these products out is that ports and an extensive railway network were also built, which would come in handy later. At the same time, newspapers, political parties, trade unions, and higher education institutions were also established, which would gradually develop the region, which would eventually become a country over time. And so that is how things would remain for a number of years until things really began to change following World War II, which was the case for many African colonies. After World War II, we would see the period of decolonization. It is during this period of decolonization that in the year 1956, oil fields would be discovered in Nigeria, which 4 years later, in 1960, when they would gain their independence, was going to be a massive boon. The discovery of any natural resource is welcome, but discovering oil, and in such large quantities that eventually Nigeria would become the largest oil producer in all of Africa, well, that is something that would make it a very strong boon indeed. Or at least, it should have, but things almost immediately went to crap after Nigeria gained its independence and then became a republic in 1963. What do I mean? You may wonder. Well, my friends, after independence, things became exceptionally messy, and it is from a number of the problems that we see here that things are carried forward even until today. See, after a brief honeymoon period, Nigeria's long-standing regional stresses caused by varying different issues such as ethnic competitiveness, educational inequality, economic imbalance, all of these varying things from all these varying different cultures and peoples kind of came to a boil, specifically in the controversial census of 1962 to 1963. See, in an attempt to stave off ethnic conflict, the Midwest region was created in August of 1963 by dividing the Western region. They were trying to separate people within the country. But the thing is, instead of balancing things out, what instead happened is that the country was effectively segmented into 3 large geographical regions, each of which was essentially controlled by an ethnic group. The West by the Yoruba, the East by the Igbo, and the North by the Hausa Fulani. You can almost say from the very beginning that it was like 3 separate little countries that were technically united into one, but they didn't necessarily like each other all that much. Conflicts were constant all over the place in many different ways. Regional leaders would try to protect their privileges, the South would oftentimes complain of Northern domination, and the North was constantly afraid that Southern elites were going to try and capture their power. In the West, things didn't even function at all. The government had effectively collapsed in 1962, and a boycott of the federal election in December of 1964 would bring the country to just the brink of total collapse. Eventually, the point of no return would be reached in January of 1966, this being after order in the West had completely collapsed, following the rather fraudulent election in October of 1965. So, a group of army officers attempted to overthrow the federal government. When this happened, Prime Minister Balewa and two of the regional premiers ended up being murdered. After this, a military administration would be set up under Major General Johnson Oguyi Ironsi, but his plan to just get rid of the regions altogether and then impose a unitary government, this was met with anti-Igbo riots in the north. The varying different ethnic groups did not like the idea of being smushed into one. The military intervention worsened the political situation as the army itself became split along ethnic lines, because go figure, they were recruiting from pretty much all the varying peoples who did not like what they were doing. Its officers had a tendency to clash and fight each other over power, and instigators and leaders of the January coup were accused of favoring Igbo domination. From this, in July of 1966, officers from the Northern Territory went and staged a counter-coup. Ironsi was assassinated, and then after him, you would have Lieutenant Colonel, who later became General, Yakubu Gowon, who would come to power. So okay, at this point, we have two coups. Just make sure when I say this right now, keep count. In fact, Dakota, my editor, go ahead and put a count up here in the corner that just says how many coups we're at now, because it's going to go up. Following his takeover of power, Gowon would attempt to try and hold things together by having a conference to settle the constitutional future of Nigeria. But this ultimately ended up being abandoned after a series of ethnic massacres would occur in October of 1966. And by spring of 1967, the country was just in an all-out state of civil war. From the period of 1967 to 1970, you would have the Biafra War, the civil war that was raged in southeast Nigeria, one of the worst humanitarian disasters of modern times, where it's estimated that millions of Biafran people died due to the conflict as well as starvation. Now, my friends, I'm not going to go into the details of that. We're going to skip past a lot of it, but that is something that I'd probably like to cover in a future podcast episode. There's just simply no way that YouTube would allow a lot of the things that we would need to say. Either way, in the end, the war would eventually come to an end, but that did not mean freedom for people. Instead, what would happen is there would be a series of military governments that would go on for decades. You see, my friends, General Gowon was able through his own ability to reconcile the two sides so that the former Biafran states were integrated back into the country once again and ended up not being blamed for the war, which, I guess is easier to do after millions of people die, so there's less people to resist. But either way, he technically fixed it. The oil boom that followed the war subsequently would then allow the federal government to finance varying different development programs and consolidate its own power. Things, at that point, looked to be up for Nigeria. But it gets messy again. In 1974, Gowon would go and postpone until 1976 the target date for a return to civilian rule. There were supposed to be elections, and he was supposed to allow this, but he just kept on kicking the can down the road in order to avoid this and maintain power. As a result, he was overthrown in July of 1975 in a coup and would flee to Great Britain. So yes, there's another coup. But wait, guess what? The new head of state, Brigadier General Murtala Ramat Mohammed, this guy would try to initiate many different changes during his time in office, which ended up being quite brief. He began the process of trying to move the federal capital back to Abuja, as well as address the issue of government inefficiency. And most importantly of all, he initiated the process for a return to civilian rule. But he ends up getting assassinated in 1976. This being during an unsuccessful coup attempt. So the leader still died, and we're still going to count that as a coup because that happened. When this happened, it would be his top aide, Lieutenant General Olusegun Obasanjo, who would become head of the government after him. Now, Obasanjo did try to pursue Mohammed's desire to return the country to civilian rule. As a first step, a new constitution was put forth that replaced the British-style parliamentary system with a presidential one. Essentially, the president would be granted greater power, but could only assume office after winning 1/4 of the votes in 2/3 of the states in the federation. This way you couldn't have something that is just purely along ethnic lines. With that development, after this, you would see many different political parties that would emerge within the nation. But ultimately, only 5 of these ended up being registered as legitimate. You had the National Party of Nigeria, the NPN, the Unity Party of Nigeria, the People's Redemption Party, or PRP, the Great Nigeria People's Party, and the Nigeria's People Party. So you had the Great People's Party and then just the People's Party. It may sound confusing, but that's what happened. Every single one of these groups promised to do pretty much the same thing. They were going to improve education, improve social services, they were going to provide welfare, they were going to rebuild the economy, and they were going to support private industry, which even sounds weird for some of the more socialist ones, but they did want to actually do this. In addition to that, every single one wanted to pursue a anti-imperialist foreign policy. They did not want to deal with the colonizers anymore. As it would turn out, Sehu Shigari, the candidate of the more right-wing NPN, he would narrowly win the 1979 presidential election. But now, all that being said, for those of you who have seen a variety of videos on my channel, you can probably guess what happens next because it is a, unfortunately, very common circumstance. In this newly democratized nation in which political parties that did not have power before suddenly come into power, things got pretty corrupt pretty fast. The NPN party leaders, generally over the course of their rule, ended up using political power as an opportunity to gain access to the public treasury and then distribute privileges to their followers. Naturally speaking from this, many of the public were quite angry and challenged the idea of even having a democracy that would just end up producing leaders that did not want to improve their lives, just enrich themselves. But somehow, even in this kind of political climate, Shigari was able to be reelected president in September of 1983. Although, that all being said, his landslide victory was attributed largely to gross voting irregularities. In other words, he did not win this whole thing legitimately. His rule, however, would not last for very long. Shigari was not able to actually manage the political crisis that followed the voting issues from his election, or to end Nigeria's continuing economic decline, which, as a result of, the military would seize the opportunity to stage a coup in December of 1983 that would bring Major General Muhammad Buhari to power. So yes, coups for days, my friends. We have another one, and it does not end there. Because you see, instead of fixing things immediately after, Buhari, after taking power, decided to wage a war against indiscipline. This being something which would result in the arrest, detention, and jailing of a number of different politicians. Now, to be fair, when we talk about this, many of these were likely corrupt or incompetent officials, yes. But as time went on, the war against indiscipline began to be gradually expanded upon to include more and more people who were unrelated to any of the issues that the country had been facing, such as going after journalists who questioned the government. As a result of actions like this, the government would rapidly lose popularity, and a switch-up became necessary. So it was then that General Ibrahim Babangida would assume power following another coup in August of 1985. I'm sure that for anyone watching right now, this whole thing is just a little bit messy to follow. That's why we got the counter up here, I hope. And can you guess what happens next then? If your answer in the comments was, it doesn't end there, it only gets worse, yeah, you're right. You see, in the beginning, Babangida at first tried to present to the public and the media an image of being a very affectionate and considerate leader, someone who cared about the public and wanted to return democracy to the country. He did things such as release political detainees, which was a very big step, and he promised that public opinion was going to influence his decisions and those of the Armed Forces Ruling Council, which was the supreme governing body under the military that controlled everything. This was nice, of course, but the public demanded an end to military rule. Babangida would, of course, publicly support this. He would call continuously for a return to civilian government. But the entire time that he was doing this, he was working to undermine the process to actually return said power to a civilian government. And here's how this whole thing went down. So a transition program was announced in 1986 that was supposed to end in 1990, though this ended up being later extended to 1993. That entire process was controlled by the military. What they then did is the government created two political parties, the Social Democrat Party, the SDP, and the National Republican Convention, or NRC. And from there, they produced the agendas of these political parties for them. Yes, you heard me right. The military basically said, okay, we're going to create two sides of a coin, and we're going to tell you what each of you believe, and then we're going to let people vote for you based off of that. Not actually allow them to form their own opinions. Any parties that formed on their own or from actual agendas that they crafted themselves, these were not allowed to be registered. And many politicians were banned outright from entering politics. This is how things were set to go until eventually there would be presidential elections. But that didn't end up happening in 1990 as it was supposed to. Instead, things were supposed to happen in 1993, but Babangida would go and void the presidential primary elections that were held in 1992. In fact, all candidates from this primary were banned from politics. Despite that, a presidential election was still supposed to occur in June of 1993, this being between two pro-government candidates, being Chief Abiola of the SDP and Alhaj Bashir Tofa of the NRC. Weirdly enough, the military government under Babangida did not actually believe that the elections were going to ever take place, and even then, they felt that if the elections somehow did happen, that because of the divides within the country between the North and the South and the very different ethnic groups, that it was going to lead to a stalemate and no one was actually going to win. Thus, they would just continue their mandate and rule. But, contrary to the expectation by the government, the election ended up being held just as scheduled and largely was regarded as free, fair, and peaceful. In the end, Chief Abiola won, which you would think at that point, okay, we're going to have a transition to civilian rule, but Babangida then goes and annuls the results right before they become official. Yes, we have what effectively would be another coup attempt. But this, my friends, would turn out to be a serious miscalculation that would end up forcing him out of power in August of 1993. And from that, we would have an interim national government that would be instituted. And it is here that you'd probably think, okay, it's an interim government, things are going to transition, that's where it's going to end. No, but close. The interim government was not popular. And after a short while, you would have General Sani Abacha, who was the defense minister under Babangida, who would overthrow it in November and reinstate military rule, which put us right back to square one. The hilarious but also simultaneously sad part about that is that, like Babangida, he would also promise to transition to civilian rule while pursuing the means to maintain power. The difference became, though, that unlike Babangida, Abacha was willing to use excessive force to attain his ambition. Yes, my friends, more coups, and it's going to get brutal. You have to understand with the story that we've been telling here so far that the entire history of Nigeria up until this point has not been stable in basically any way, shape, or form. Everything has been uncertain. The country has been constantly divided, and no one really knows what is going on or whether anything will be saved. If the political future of Nigeria appeared to finally be back on the right track with the victory of Chief Abiola in June of 1993, Abacha's seizure of power and his subsequent rule, that would almost reverse all of the gains that the country had made since the 60s. What I mean by that is that the Abacha regime basically did any bad thing that you could possibly imagine. They ignored due process of law, they violated press freedom, there was no individual liberty, no human rights. The government would use violence as a weapon against its critics, opponents, and anyone who dared to question it. When Abiola, the guy who won the election the previous year in 1993, proclaimed himself president, he ended up being arrested in June of 1994 and would ultimately die in jail in 1998. Any kind of trade union was suspended. Protesters were constantly being killed. But despite this crackdown, despite the violence, opposition to the government did not go away. People would continue to fight, and Abacha and his loyalists would continue to use the state and its treasury as their own kind of personal piggy bank. Where things would suddenly change, the decisive turning point for the military would come when Abacha would suddenly die in June of 1998. It was after his death that General Abdul Salam Abubakar would be appointed to replace him, and this guy, like the others, had promised to transfer power to civilians. But unlike the others, he actually did this. He freed political prisoners, he ended the harassment of political opponents, and he even set forth a timetable to actually transition to civilian rule. From this, the international image of the country would improve. But after years, or decades rather, of violence and political oppression, economic performance was still rather slow. The country was still quite underdeveloped. I mean, go figure, when we talk about this, literally decades of military rule and mismanagement, it doesn't exactly help a country to grow and develop. But change was on the horizon. It is in this time period after Abacha's death that political activity would grow rapidly, as numerous different parties were formed. Of these, there would be 3 that would emerge that were able to actually compete in the elections. You had the People's Democratic Party, the PDP, the Alliance for Democracy, and the All People's Party. These would be the main players in the upcoming elections. A series of these elections were then held from January to March of 1999, in which councilors for local governments, legislatures for state and federal assemblies, and state governors were all selected. It was a complete redo and overhaul of the entire country. The presidential election would take place in February, and this was something that was actually carefully being monitored by international teams of observers. And it is from this that we would get a familiar character, Olusegun Obasanjo of the PDP, who had been head of state from 1976 to 1979 and had actually overseen the last transition from military rule. He was declared the winner. Now, I know that I said that I wasn't going to go into the entire history of Nigeria. I understand that, but you have to understand the pain of all of this to understand where it is that things rapidly begin to change going into the modern day and age and the current issues. All of this is tied together. It is finally at this point that we would have a return to civilian governance. And from that, the economy would flourish, at least for a time. Over the course of the year 2000 all the way through 2014, the country would average a GDP growth rate of 7%, which is quite strong. That is pretty impressive. Not only that, but while oil and gas definitely remained critical sources of government income for exports, the country's entire resource sector in 2014 only accounted for around 14% of the GDP, which is relatively low considering what you would see of most export extraction-based economies. Technically speaking, Nigeria was no longer a petrostate, as many Middle Eastern countries had become. Agriculture and trade were larger and faster growing. Manufacturing and retail were becoming commonplace. Nigeria, at this time, was predicted to be the upcoming super economy of Africa, easily overtaking South Africa, which was the previous number one that we've covered on this channel here before, and all their varying different issues and why their economy collapsed. Even without considering where they came from, it was genuinely impressive growth. However, even with that growth, there were still problems that could be seen pretty clearly in the 2010s. You see, my friends, the results of Nigeria's economic progress were not evenly spread. More than 40% of Nigerians lived below the official poverty line. As for why that is the case, there are a number of different reasons, but some of the primary ones were that farms were not very productive, despite being able to still produce more, which I'm going to need to explain that here in a second, and also the urbanization process of Nigeria wasn't the best. If that sounds vague, I understand. Please allow me to explain. What I mean by that is that while crop yields had technically speaking improved in recent years, they remained way below that of peer nations, as Nigerian farmers oftentimes had limited access to productivity improving things, such as fertilizer or mechanized tools. In short, the reason that farming increased in terms of productivity, or rather raw numbers, was because more manual labor, more farm hands were able to be used, more land was able to be cleared, and then that land had food grown upon it. It didn't actually mean that the individual farms that were already there became inherently more productive. So their productivity per person was actually quite low. In addition to that, between high post-harvest losses and an inefficient market system, farmers were oftentimes receiving only a small share of the value of their work. Low productivity plus low efficiency means less resources that you're going to have to spare afterwards, and so things kind of continue at just the same pace. The same thing would also apply to a worse degree inside of cities. What I mean by that is that urban poverty is oftentimes driven by a couple things. People not having good employment opportunities, or rather there not being enough employment, and perhaps that employment not being productive in and of itself. In Nigeria, workers in urban-oriented industries such as manufacturing, weirdly enough, have lower productivity levels than farm workers. Like manufacturing jobs, things that typically speaking are supposed to be able to produce far more with less labor, don't actually produce nearly as much as they should. Farmers end up being more productive per person than a person working in a factory. If that sounds weird to you, yes, this is the exact opposite of what normally happens as economies develop and urbanize. People typically become more productive when they move into cities. But instead, people become less. In addition to these issues, this lack of productivity, at the same time that this would happen, high youth unemployment would aid the recruitment and action of terrorist organizations such as Boko Haram, which, as you can probably imagine from a terrorist organization, would further increase instability within the country. See, starting around 2008, Boko Haram has carried out a variety of different attacks in Nigeria in order to spread their Islamic influence and defeat Westernization. One of the key reasons that they were able to grow so rapidly was specifically because of the unemployment situation. Young men with nothing else that they could possibly do, who felt desperate and like they had been lost by society, would sign up with an organization like them. Approximately 64 million youths are unemployed in Nigeria, with 1.6 million being underemployed. In joining such an organization, they would gain a new purpose, but that purpose would be to attack individuals or organizations who follow more Western lifestyles. Oftentimes, these attacks are specifically targeted towards women seeking education in schools. As one can probably imagine from that, this is not good for an economy. Boko Haram is believed to be responsible for roughly 10,000 deaths as well as 2.6 million displaced Nigerians since the year 2011. As time went on, Nigeria's economy would suffer as attacks by Boko Haram would begin on local businesses, government buildings, and local facilities such as churches and schools. When this would happen, it would oftentimes completely depopulate regions, and local businesses would begin to migrate to southern regions of Nigeria after being attacked. What this would result in is entire regions of the country stagnating, losing their businesses, and then decaying, which is not good. But despite these issues, the economy of Nigeria would still grow at a rate of around 7% per year, and things were looking up. That is, until 2015 rolled around, and everything went to crap. Everything at this point that I've been describing so far is creating the setting of Nigeria, of what we are walking into for the modern day. But it is here that we see the turning point that really begins to create the problems that would be the main drivers behind the protests. You see, my friends, although Nigeria, technically speaking, is not a petrostate per se, it is still Africa's largest producer of oil. And from that, Nigeria's economic fortunes have been closely tied to its oil exports, which accounts for over 90% of its foreign exchange earnings and about 60% of government revenues. It is a lot of money. Taxation was and is highly inefficient in the country, which meant that oil was where the state primarily obtained most of its operation funds from. We're going to talk about that whole inefficiency here soon because, oh boy, is that going to bite again here later. Anyway, in the years prior to the economic downturn, this period of growth was something that would fuel ambitious national goals, including extensive infrastructure projects and poverty alleviation efforts, mass handouts, social programs, these kinds of things. But the government's heavy reliance upon oil made it extremely vulnerable to any kind of global price fluctuations. And y'all remember what I've mentioned here multiple times on this channel about what happened in the mid-2010s and the price of oil? Yes, when that price crashed, that was going to be a problem. Between mid-2014 and early 2016, the global economy experienced one of the largest oil price declines in modern history, with prices dropping by some 70%. This would hit Nigeria's economy rather hard. The situation was further exacerbated by the Boko Haram insurgency in the northwest, which at a time when the country did not have money, ended up taking away a lot of resources from economic development and had to push it towards fighting the insurgency instead. The government's inability to quickly diversify the economy and its reliance upon oil for foreign exchange left the nation absolutely reeling from the effects of the oil price drop. As a result of this, in 2016, Nigeria would enter its first recession in over 2 decades, with a GDP of around $404 billion and a GDP per capita of $2,145. Its growth rate for that year was minus 1.62%. In response, the administration of President Muhammadu Buhari would introduce the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, or ERGP. This initiative was something that aimed to diversify the economy, to reduce dependence upon oil, and also to encourage private sector investment. Now, although the ERGP did lead to improvements in agriculture and also minerals and other extraction, the overall impact was rather limited by a number of issues that the country faced, namely corruption. Like, even if you want to go and stimulate an economy and push a bunch of money into a sector in order to improve it, if a good percentage of that money has already been taken by the politicians that are supposed to be creating it, it doesn't really work very well. That all being said, eventually things were going to recover, at least a bit. But then the COVID-19 pandemic would hit in 2020, which would further deepen Nigeria's economic challenges. The global economic slowdown, combined with lockdown measures, would result in a significant drop in oil demand and prices again, which would severely impact Nigeria's economy. It would be during this period that Nigeria would face its second recession in just 5 years. The country's GDP would fall to $430 billion, with a GDP per capita of $2,075, meaning that even if the economy, technically speaking, had grown since the earlier years, the actual amount of money that each person had was less. This is bad, and the government basically couldn't do anything during this time. They were limited by their own lack of money in the first place, which would complicate any efforts to try and fix the economy. But wait, it gets worse, which I feel like I'm saying that a lot here in this episode. Because after 2 years of COVID and financial instability, 2022 rolls around and we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Nigeria's economy would take a massive hit from Russia's invasion and the resulting Western sanctions. Nigeria was, after all, Africa's top oil producer, but it ended up, weirdly enough, suffering from the wartime oil price hike because even if Nigeria produces a lot of raw crude oil, it has to import refined oil in order to meet its own domestic demand. The subsequent economic hit would lead Nigeria to try to advocate for a political resolution as soon as possible, even while, technically speaking, opposing Russia's invasion. Weirdly enough, from all this, and this is something that's going to become relevant here in just a bit when I mention something else, but Nigeria is actually quite friendly to Russia due to the fact that it's part of OPEC. Therefore, although it did condemn the invasion and called for Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukrainian territory, simultaneously it refused to join the West's coalition against Moscow. But either way, moving on from that, Nigeria was in yet another crisis, its third one, economically speaking, in just about 6 years. The government had to do something, but it needed money to do anything. And so it was then that on October 26, 2022, the Central Bank of Nigeria would announce a very bold move. What they were going to do was redesign the country's highest denomination note, that being of 200, 500, and 1,000 naira. And as for the old notes they had of this currency, that was going to be removed from circulation. Now, this is not something that is necessarily all that weird. Many countries have done things where they remove certain notes from circulation. This happens, but people were given a deadline of January 31st, 2023, meaning they pretty much just had 3 months. That's it. And this exchange was set to happen just a couple weeks before the next national election. If they did not change their notes by this time, all of those old notes would cease to be valid legal tender, and they would lose all that money. You may wonder why it is that the country would decide to do this here in the first place, and the reason is a couple of things. The move aimed to, in the first place, curb counterfeiting. They wanted to stop people from trying to print these largest notes, which was flooding the country with fake currency, which is a problem they had already been experiencing. Simultaneously, they wanted people to stop using their cash and instead use cashless transactions, which could be tracked and actually taxed. And the final point was to limit the buying of votes during the elections, because if they take all that money out of circulation, then anyone who accepted bribes in order to get their vote would now then not be able to use that currency in the first place. The thing about all this is that while the intention of it is pretty solid, it makes sense when you present it as an argument, the execution of it was terrible. Short deadlines, limited availability of new notes, like people would literally show up to the bank to get the notes and there just weren't any left, and also inadequate communication would create widespread panic as no one knew what was going on. It led to very long queues at banks in lines, frustration among citizens, and a black market that would thrive off of the chaos to rip as much money out of people as they could. One of the most dangerous effects about this entire thing is that the confusion ended up having the unintended consequence of making people lose faith in the currency itself. People began to look at other currencies to store value, with the obvious choices being foreign currency like the US dollar and the British pound, but also cryptocurrencies. Yeah, some cryptocurrencies were seen as more stable than the actual currency of the country. From beginning to end, this entire thing was a disaster, and the currency redesign was criticized at the time by the then presidential candidate of the ruling party, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, who saw it as a move to derail his presidential campaign. However, despite this issue, Tinubu won the contested election and, once in power, set to reshape the economy immediately. Entering into a period of rapid economic decline and instability, he was going to change things even more. In his inaugural address in May of 2023, Tinubu would announce that the fuel subsidy is gone, this being something that would refer to the government's long-standing subsidized petrol policy that ensured Nigerians actually enjoyed some of the lowest costing fuel in the entire world. We're talking, at the time, paying like 12 cents per liter. Over the coming days, he would also announce the reversal of the currency redesign policy and that the Nigerian naira was going to float on the foreign exchange market. And yes, I may have mentioned something like that here before over the course of this video, and I have most certainly mentioned it in other videos when I talked about countries such as Egypt, but Nigeria, like Egypt, had been artificially keeping its currency value higher in order to strengthen its import abilities. This was being done at great cost through using foreign exchange reserves, which had been severely depleted by the oil issue that we already mentioned here. Combine that with a large foreign debt and shaky global economy, and things were getting pretty rough. That all being said, the removal of the fuel subsidy is kind of a mixed bag, but I'm going to need to explain this. When the removal of the fuel subsidy was announced, it was initially met with a mix of surprise and also happiness by international donor agencies, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, who had long time been advocating for its removal. Yes, it was something that helped the everyday average citizen within Nigeria, but simultaneously, it was a massive deficit to the state, something that it could not afford and would only create further problems as time went on for the economy. So its removal was seen as a necessary and good thing, if harsh. But all of this was before the effects of it began to tear into the country. The price of gasoline, which used to retail for 189 naira, or around 12 cents per liter, would increase by 196% practically overnight and began to retail for 557 naira per liter. This was pretty bad for just about everyone. You see, my friends, one of the challenging things with developing economies like Nigeria is that a rise in fuel price tends to cause the price of everything to rise. Many industries, particularly those in manufacturing and agriculture, tend to rely heavily on fuel for powering machinery and equipment due to the fact that there's just really not a good national electricity system. The majority of people have to utilize generators in order to operate anything, which in turn creates a high demand for fuel. A price increase for fuel, one that doubles or triples it, drastically increases operating costs and will destroy businesses. Naturally, many Nigerian households were significantly affected by the increased prices, but most people understood that there was an opportunity in this, that even if the cost of fuel went up, the cost of paying for that fuel subsidy would be able to be used instead to improve education, healthcare, general welfare, anything that was needed to actually increase the state. This is something that had been promised over the course of the election itself, that it would be removed, but that money would be redirected elsewhere. If you're wondering about the amount of money we're talking about here, that is around 400 billion naira a month. So it was harsh, but necessary. The big killer for the economy, though, would come on June 14th, 2023. That being when the Tinubu government would end the policy of pegging the naira to the US dollar and allow it to float and find its true market value based off supply and demand. The idea behind this was that it was supposed to stop corruption and simultaneously reduce arbitrage opportunities due to the differences between official and black market foreign exchange prices. For anyone who is confused, and I've explained this in previous videos, currency arbitrage is something that happens when people go and buy a currency at the lower official exchange rate and then immediately sell it at the higher black market rate for a profit. The practice often occurs where there are very strict currency controls and black markets offer a truer reflection of the actual currency's value because it is based on real supply and demand. This would be seen as necessary, but it ended up being one policy change too many and it was not implemented well. When this happened, the naira would lose a whopping 25% of its value in just one day, and the cascading effects would absolutely rip into the country. You see, my friends, Nigeria depends heavily upon imported commodities, including essential goods like food, fuel, and medicine. So this policy escalated the inflationary crisis that was already happening in the country, and it pushed inflation to almost 30%, with some commodities like food already inflating to 35%. Imports in general became significantly more expensive, and Nigerians practically overnight saw their purchasing power wiped out, gone, because their wages did not increase to ever meet these costs. Businesses across the country effectively collapsed as they no longer had the foreign exchange currency that was necessary for importing products, whether raw or manufactured, to perform their businesses. The economy from this teetered on full-scale collapse, and in response, the Central Bank of Nigeria would go and implement a number of different measures to stop the crisis. It would go and raise interest rates and began selling US dollars through auctions. But these measures in turn were double-sided, as it simultaneously hurt people's ability to borrow money for businesses businesses, which in turn slowed down the economy even further because less business was being performed. And that, my friends, finally then brings us to August of 2024, when people could not take it anymore and began to protest. For the first 10 days in August, Nigerians across the nation would protest against bad governance and also the downturn of their economic fortunes. In addition to protesting food and fuel prices, people were also angry at the apparent indifference and hypocrisy of the government. If you're wondering what I mean by that, there was a number of budget padding scandals, which, to clarify that is where a budget is artificially inflated or reduced in order to divert funds away, which is oftentimes done for corrupt purposes. Yes, there were many allegations of public money being spent on a presidential yacht, private jets, also things like getting public officials fleets of SUVs. This was all happening while the country was suffering, and in general, the population began to develop a sense that the political rich were just getting richer, and the country's poor were getting poorer, and the middle class itself, which was already small, was about to be wiped out. As a result of these things, it is perhaps unsurprising to guess then that the End Bad Governance and End Hunger protests were going to happen. Organizers of the protests would give the government 2 weeks' notice. In that time, current and former officials at just about every level, from across legislative, executive, judiciary, military, police, anyone who was affiliated with the government would speak out against any potential protests, demanding instead that dialogue take place. The reason the government would say that the protest had to be quashed is because inevitably these things would be hijacked by hoodlums of some type and from there cause wanton destruction. Of course, the public was not going to back down. And when it became clear that protests could not be stopped, court orders were instead sought to hem protesters into designated areas for them to protest. So, in other words, you would be able to demand that the government do something about the previously affordable staples such as rice and eggs and yams now being luxury goods, but you were only allowed to protest for these things in certain designated places that the government allowed you to. As an example of this, in the capital Abuja, you were allowed to do this at the National Stadium, which would be away from any neighborhood eyes that potentially could see you, away from government buildings or anywhere else that protesters could suddenly turn to if things got violent. And even then, you still might be shot at by police or the military, and in some unfortunate cases, even killed. Because yes, my friends, over the course of these protests, people were indeed killed. And now we're going to need to dive back into the actual events of these protests that we talked about and mentioned in the very beginning. On August 1st, protests began peacefully across Nigeria in multiple states, as well as the capital Abuja. But a number of these protests ended up turning violent after the Nigerian police force would shoot tear gas and live bullets at protesters in the capital in an attempt to try and disperse them. Protests would then turn violent in multiple other states, including Kano, Jigawa, and Gombe, as police would use live ammunition to try and disperse the protesters there. Following this, curfews were subsequently declared to try and get people off of the streets. It's at this time, my friends, that the first casualties start to be recorded. 3 protesters were reportedly killed by the police in Kaduna after protesters barricaded the Abuja-Kaduna Expressway. Along with this, in the same state, at least 25 protesters were arrested after the security forces used tear gas to disperse them as they tried to break in the Kaduna state government house. Elsewhere, 2 people would get killed as angry protesters burned down the All Progressives Congress, or APC, secretariat in Jigawa State. There was no turning back at this point. Moving on to the next day, on August 2nd, protests would continue in cities across the country in defiance of the curfews. As violence raged, the Nigerian military would call for both local and international media to stop covering the End Bad Governance protests because, apparently, per the police, people were just doing it to get attention. And yes, I'm not kidding. That is an actual argument that was made by the Chief of Defense Staff, Christopher Gwabin Musa. Additionally, reports also indicated that telecom networks were being purposely slowed down to stop information flow from the protesters. The very next day, August 3rd, protesters would assemble at a major stadium in Abuja. But when this happened, police would deploy tear gas to disperse them when they tried to march on a main road leading to the city center. In another state, in Kano, things got even weirder when Russian flags, amazingly enough, started appearing in the protests. Yes, that's right. Similar to what we saw with American flags being waved in Hong Kong years ago during their own protests, some protesters in Kano State actually waved Russian flags, calling for President Vladimir Putin's intervention in the country. The Russian embassy in Abuja would subsequently say that, no, we are not a part of this. The flags were personal choices of protesters, and they denied ever interfering in Nigeria's internal affairs. But from that, things were going to continue. The next day, August 4th, it became clear that the protests were not simply going to go away, and the government had to actually step in now and do something. On the fourth day of the protest, President Bola Tinubu would address the country, acknowledging the, quote, pain and frustration of the public, and from that would urge protesters to please halt further demonstrations in favor of dialogue, of talking things out. He would stress over the course of the speech the importance of preventing violence and damage, while highlighting the fact that his administration had done a lot to stabilize the economy and enhance public welfare. However, with how angry people already were, his speech failed to address any of their demands, which resulted in the public becoming even angrier. Hundreds of protests would then resume the next day, August 5th, in Lagos, Abuja, Kano, Kaduna, Borno, and more states. Protesters in Lagos and Abuja ended up being met by strong opposition from law enforcement agencies and were asked to return home. Meanwhile, protests in the north became increasingly violent, and instead of 10 days of protests, they became the 10 days of rage. A number of protesters in this time would be waving Russian flags during these and be arrested. If you're noticing a trend at this point, yes, that's right. That exact same thing would end up happening the next day, and 40 people would end up being arrested after waving Russian flags. This is how things would effectively continue for a while, until you would get to the last several days. The 3 final days of the demonstrations were much more somber in comparison to the previous ones. These would largely be dedicated to mourning and honoring those who had lost their lives in the fights and protests. And after that, on the final day, everything was supposed to end with something that would be called the Million Man March on August 10th. Something in which many of the protests were supposed to converge on the Capitol and march through it to showcase their strength. However, per the reports of this event, turnout of it ended up being far lower than was actually expected. The police were out in force, and many people, it seemed, were afraid of potential violence. With that, the protests would end just as scheduled on August 10th. It's then in the aftermath of these protests that it is natural then to wonder whether or not they did actually achieve their goals. The government, after all, did not concede to any of the protesters' demands, so on that note, they did end up failing. But what they did succeed in doing in this case is bringing international attention to the issues that were plaguing the country. Hunger, fuel subsidies, employment, government corruption, all of these things were discussed. And it is important that we talk about and recognize the fact that most people within Nigeria likely understand the necessity of removing the fuel subsidies in the first place, this being part of the broader strategy to try and revive the economy that has been effectively on life support for decades. But the important thing then is that the End Bad Governance protest did succeed at least in doing what very few movements in recent history had done. They had shown that not just a subset of society, that the entirety of society was upset with the government. The protesters delivered a clear and unequivocal message on the issue of corruption, and they demanded that the government was not going to simply ignore them. For the government, these protests would expose deep socioeconomic disparities. At the same time, it would most certainly highlight the differences between the North and the South, where things in the South largely remained mostly peaceful protests, while the North became exceptionally violent. While the South has relatively seen more economic development, the North remains mired in poverty, underdevelopment, and insecurity to this very day. That disparity is a ticking time bomb, and the government from these protests can see that this is where significantly more violence is going to come from. If left unaddressed, it would lead to even greater issues. Whether or not the government will do anything to fix this, whether or not it can, that is really anyone's guess. At this point in time, the only thing that we could really do is talk about how it is that we got to where it is that we are today. And that, my friends, is why Nigeria is in the situation that it is. Its problems are many, and its solutions grow fewer by the day. But we will see what happens, and most certainly we will talk about and explain it here in the future. My friends, this has been Stakuyi with another History of Everything podcast YouTube episode exploring an issue. I appreciate all of you going and joining with me here today. Please make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know in the comment section below here what it is that you would like for us to address next. There are many different topics that we plan on working on, but if there is anything that
Yeah.
Check me out. Superstars Media. Lord Logan. But let me turn Lord Logan. And it's Wild Flora Show. 1914 amalgamation is what we dying for. 3 nations to 1 nation. Ever since annihilation. Nepotism is nonsense. You and you, clap your hand, clap your hands. Biafra gonna come, clap your hand, clap your hands. Biafra, Odudua, we're free now. Freedom is gonna come, we're free now. Yeah.